December 16, 1944, Bastogne. Major Joseph Winters watched 18 soldiers from his company die, not because they were physically weak, not because they were poorly trained, but because 5 specific mental errors had completely destroyed their discipline in the weeks leading up to the German attack. Technically competent soldiers who had survived months of combat suddenly collapsed under pressure because they were making the same 5 thinking errors that turned discipline into chaos. My wife found Winters' diary years after his death, and the first line of December 16th read, "They didn't die for lack of discipline. They died because 5 mental patterns destroyed the discipline they had." During the 23 days he was besieged in Bastogne, Winters meticulously documented the 5 mental errors he observed, destroying the discipline of the soldiers around him. What devastated him was not that these errors were obvious or easily identifiable. They were subtle, disguised as normal. Thoughts accepted as truths by soldiers who didn't even realize they were systematically destroying their own discipline through specific mental patterns. My wife recorded that Winters survived Bastogne not because he avoided making the 5 errors, but because he identified them the moment they arose and corrected them before they could destroy his discipline. You will discover exactly what these 5 mental errors are that destroy discipline without you realizing it, how to identify them when they occur, and the exact protocol Winters developed to correct them before they turn you into yet another casualty of the invisible war against yourself. I found Major Joseph Winters' diary in a locked wooden box in the closet of his room that he never let anyone open, hidden behind military uniforms he kept for 50 years after returning from the war. Winters had commanded a company during the Battle of Bastogne, and when he died in 1994, he left specific instructions that the box should only be opened after his death. When I finally opened it, I understood why. What Winters documented was not war heroism or military victories. It was the brutal discovery that discipline doesn't fail for lack of will or effort. It fails because of 5 specific mental errors that disciplined soldiers unknowingly commit, transforming strength into weakness through invisible thought patterns. The first entry, from December 16, 1944, read, "I watched 18 soldiers die today, not because they were undisciplined, but because 5 mental errors they didn't even know they were committing had completely destroyed the discipline they possessed." During 23 days besieged in Bastogne, Winters not only survived, he obsessively studied why disciplined soldiers suddenly collapsed under pressure, not undisciplined or lazy soldiers, but men who had demonstrated exceptional discipline for months, who followed orders perfectly, who maintained rigorous routines. And suddenly, under massive German attack, this discipline crumbled completely. Winters noted in disturbing detail how these soldiers didn't lose discipline gradually. They lost it suddenly and totally, as if a switch had been flipped. And when he investigated what had happened in the weeks leading up to the collapse, he discovered a consistent pattern. The same 5 mental errors appeared in every case. Soldiers who made these errors systematically destroyed their own discipline without understanding what they were doing. But what I noted most attentively was the passage where Winters explained that the 5 errors were invisible because they appeared to be normal and acceptable thoughts. They weren't obviously destructive. They were disguised as practical wisdom, realistic thinking, honest self-knowledge, and soldiers accepted them as truths without question because they seemed reasonable on the surface. But beneath that reasonable surface, each error was systematically destroying the mental foundation that sustained discipline. Winters wrote, "I discovered that discipline is not destroyed by obvious laziness or weakness. It is destroyed by 5 mental patterns that seem harmless but function like termites eating away at the wooden structure from the inside out." You are making the exact same 5 mistakes that destroyed the discipline of those 18 soldiers in Bastogne. You are thinking thoughts that seem normal, reasonable, even wise, without realizing that each one is systematically destroying the discipline you struggle to maintain. If you want to honor Major Joseph Winters and learn the 5 mental errors he identified before they completely destroy your discipline, leave your like now. Don't abandon this commander who spent 23 days surrounded documenting exactly how discipline is destroyed from the inside out. The first mistake Winters identified killed more soldiers at Bastogne than German bullets. He called it internal bargaining, the mental pattern where a soldier would begin debating with himself whether or not to execute an order or maintain discipline at that specific moment. Winters documented the case of Sergeant Robert Hayes, an exemplary soldier who had maintained perfect discipline for 8 months of combat. Hayes woke up at the same time every day, executed his routine flawlessly, and never questioned orders. But 3 weeks before the German attack, Winters noticed a subtle change. Hayes began to bargain with himself, not openly, internally. He would wake up and think about whether he really needed to get up at that time, or if he could stay 5 more minutes. He would receive an order and mentally assess whether it made sense before executing it. And this internal bargaining seemed reasonable. It seemed like healthy critical thinking. But Winters noted, "I observed Hayes transform from a disciplined soldier into a paralyzed man in 3 weeks through constant bargaining. Each internal debate did not strengthen discernment. It destroyed the automatism that kept discipline functioning." During those 3 weeks, Hayes spent progressively more time debating with himself and less time executing. He negotiated whether he should keep equipment organized or if he could leave it for later. He negotiated whether he should follow a checking routine or if he could skip it once. He negotiated whether he should execute an order immediately or if he could question it first. And each negotiation consumed mental energy that should have been used for execution. Winters described how when the German attack finally came, Hayes entered a state of total paralysis, not because he didn't know what to do, but because his mind had been trained for 3 weeks to negotiate before executing, and under extreme pressure, this negotiation turned into fatal paralysis. He wrote, "Hayes died not because he was undisciplined. He died because he had transformed automatic discipline into conscious decision-making through constant negotiation." But what I highlighted was the part where Winters explained that internal negotiation seemed intelligent. It seemed like critical thinking. It seemed like healthy mental autonomy. But under pressure, it turned into a self-destructive mechanism. Because discipline works through automatism, not through repeated conscious decision-making. A disciplined soldier doesn't debate if he executes an order, he simply executes. And when he transforms execution into debate, he is systematically destroying the foundation that allows discipline to function. You're making the exact mistake that killed Hayes. You're negotiating with yourself every day about whether or not you should maintain discipline. And every negotiation that resembles critical thinking is destroying the automaticity that discipline requires to function under pressure. The second mistake Winters documented was even more destructive because it seemed completely logical. Soldiers waiting to feel motivated before acting. Winters described the case of Corporal James Mitchell, a soldier who had been a model of discipline for 7 months. Mitchell performed everything perfectly as long as he felt motivated to do so. But 4 weeks before the German attack, Winters noticed that Mitchell began to gauge motivation before acting. He would wake up and assess whether he felt like getting up. He would receive a task and check if he was inspired to perform it. And when motivation was not present, he would wait for it to appear before acting. This seemed reasonable. It seemed like healthy emotional self-care. But Winters noted, "I observed Mitchell making discipline a hostage to temporary emotional states." He had inverted a fundamental relationship. It is not motivation that creates action. It is action that creates motivation. But once a soldier believes he needs to feel motivated before acting, his discipline is fundamentally broken. During those 4 weeks, Mitchell only acted when he felt the urge, and initially this worked because he still had residual motivation from months of previous discipline. But gradually, as he waited for motivation more often, motivation appeared less frequently. Because motivation is not the cause of action, it is the result of action. Each time Mitchell waited to feel motivated before acting, he was training his brain to believe that action depended on emotional state. And the brain progressively produced less motivation because it learned that it was not necessary. Winters described how when the German attack came, Mitchell was completely paralyzed. He did not carry out orders because he did not feel motivated to carry them out. And under live fire, he waited to feel courageous before acting. He waited until he died waiting. Winters wrote, Mitchell died because he had conditioned his own mind to believe that emotion precedes action. But disciplined soldiers know that action precedes emotion. But what I highlighted was the passage where Winters explained that this error was especially dangerous because modern society teaches the exact opposite. It teaches that you should wait until you feel ready before acting, that you should be inspired before executing, that forcing yourself to act without motivation is harmful. But Winters had observed that soldiers who followed this philosophy died because discipline doesn't wait for motivation. Discipline creates motivation through execution. You're doing exactly what killed Mitchell, waiting to feel motivated before acting. And every day you wait, you're training your brain to produce less motivation because it learns that it's not necessary for action to happen. The third mistake Winters identified silently killed discipline because soldiers genuinely believed they were being disciplined when they weren't. He called it the illusion of execution, where soldiers confused thinking about doing something with actually doing it. Winters documented the case of Private Daniel Crawford, a soldier who spent hours planning how he would be disciplined, deciding which routines he would follow, visualizing perfect execution. Crawford would wake up and spend 15 minutes thinking about the exercises he would do. He would receive a task and spend time planning exactly how he would execute it perfectly. And at the end of the day, he felt he had been productive because his mind had been occupied with discipline the whole time. But Winters observed a devastating pattern. Crawford planned a lot and executed little. And worse, his brain treated planning as if it were execution, giving the same neurological reward for thinking about doing it as it would for actually doing it. Winters noted, "I observed Crawford living in a parallel world where he was a disciplined soldier in his mind, but a chaotic soldier in reality. He genuinely believed he was executing because he spent so much time thinking about executing that his mind confused the two." For 5 weeks before the attack, Crawford became progressively more of a planner and less of an executor. He spent more time deciding to be disciplined and less time being disciplined. His mind was constantly occupied with intentions, plans, decisions about how tomorrow would be better. But actual actions diminished because mental energy was consumed by planning. And because planning gave a sense of progress, Crawford never realized he was regressing. Winters described a critical moment when Crawford spent 2 hours planning how he would organize equipment, but never actually did. And when questioned, Crawford defended himself by saying he had worked on it all day. Technically true in his mind, completely false in reality. When the German attack came, Crawford brutally discovered that intentions don't stop bullets. Planning doesn't execute orders. Mental decisions don't save lives. Winters wrote, "Crawford died surrounded by unexecuted intentions. His mind was full of plans to be disciplined. His reality was empty of real discipline." But what I highlighted was the passage where Winters explained that this mistake was more dangerous than obvious laziness, because a lazy person knows they're not executing. But a person who confuses intention with execution genuinely believes they are progressing. They feel productive, they feel disciplined, and this illusion prevents them from correcting their behavior because they don't realize there's a problem. You're doing exactly what killed Crawford. Confusing. Time spent thinking about being disciplined with time spent actually being disciplined. And while your mind feels productive planning, your reality remains chaotic due to a lack of real execution. If you want to learn the 2 remaining mental errors before they completely destroy your discipline, subscribe to this channel now. Join the trenches of soldiers who have decided to stop planning discipline and start executing it. Don't abandon Major Winters. Subscribe and honor the 23 days. He spent documenting how discipline is truly destroyed. The 4th error Winters documented destroyed discipline through a mental pattern where soldiers transformed a single small flaw into justification for abandoning discipline completely. He called it all-or-nothing thinking, where soldiers believed that if they couldn't do something perfectly, it wasn't worth doing anything. Winters described the case of Corporal Thomas Reed, an exceptionally disciplined soldier for 9 months. Reed maintained higher standards than any other soldier in his unit. But 2 weeks before the attack, Reed made a small mistake. He woke up 15 minutes late, and Winters observed a devastating mental shift. Reed didn't treat lateness as an isolated flaw to be corrected. He treated it as evidence that all discipline had crumbled. He thought, If I can't even wake up on time, then I'm not a disciplined person. And if I'm not disciplined, what's the point of trying? And from that single 15-minute delay, Reed progressively abandoned all the disciplinary standards he had maintained for months. Winters noted, "I observed Reed use a single imperfection as permission to abandon the perfection he had built up over 9 months. He had confused being disciplined with being perfect. During those 2 weeks, each new small failure reinforced Reed's narrative that he was no longer disciplined. He forgot to clean equipment once and thought that since he had failed, he could continue. Failing, he skipped a routine check and interpreted that as confirmation that discipline was broken, and each failure became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because when he believed he was no longer disciplined, he stopped acting in a disciplined way." Winters described how Reed developed a mental pattern where small imperfections were treated as catastrophic failures. There was no space between perfect execution and total collapse. Either he maintained a 100% standard, or he abandoned it completely. And because maintaining 100% under war is impossible, Reed was guaranteeing his own collapse. When the German attack came, Reed was mentally defeated before the first bullet. He had used a series of small failures as evidence that he no longer had discipline, and under real pressure, that belief became a fatal reality. Winters wrote, "Reed died because he believed that a disciplined soldier never fails. But soldiers who survive know that discipline is not the absence of failure. It is continuing to perform after failing." But what I highlighted was the passage where Winters explained that this error was especially destructive for people with high standards, because the more disciplined a soldier was, the more devastating the effect of a small failure. A mediocre soldier who failed didn't lose discipline because he never had it. But an exceptional soldier who failed lost everything, because he interpreted failure as evidence that exceptionality was an illusion. You're doing exactly what killed Reed, using every little flaw as justification to abandon discipline completely, as if imperfection proves you're incapable of being disciplined. The fifth and final error Winters identified was the most subtle and destructive because it destroyed discipline through impossible self-comparison. He called it the tyranny of potential, where soldiers compared actual performance with an idealized version of themselves that existed only in theory. Winters documented the case of Lieutenant William Foster, a technically superior soldier who had demonstrated exceptional ability for 6 months. Foster could perform any task perfectly when he was in better shape, more rested, and more focused. And Winters observed that Foster used this peak ability as a standard against which he measured daily performance. He would wake up after a difficult night and compare his current performance with his performance when he was fully rested. He would perform a task under pressure and compare the result with the result he achieved when he had unlimited time. And each comparison generated a feeling of failure because actual performance never matched his maximum theoretical ability. Winters noted, "I observed Foster destroy his own discipline not by comparing himself to other soldiers or to an objective standard, but by comparing himself to an impossible version of himself that only existed under perfect conditions that would never return." For 6 weeks before the attack, Foster became progressively more demotivated because nothing he did seemed sufficient. He performed tasks well, but knew he could have performed better with more energy. He maintained discipline, but knew he could have been more disciplined with fewer distractions, and this constant comparison with his maximum potential created a perpetual feeling of inadequacy. It didn't matter how much he accomplished. It was never as much as he theoretically could accomplish. Winters described how Foster developed a growing resentment against his own discipline because it never matched the impossible ideal he had created. And gradually, he stopped performing altogether because if actual performance would always fall short of theoretical capacity, what was the point of trying? When the German attack came, Foster was paralyzed not by incapacity, but by comparison. He didn't perform because he compared every possible action with the perfect version he could perform under ideal conditions that didn't exist. Winters wrote, "Foster died hoping to be a theoretical version of himself instead of the real version that could have saved his own life." But what I highlighted was the passage where Winters explained that this error was especially destructive for people with high potential, Because the greater the theoretical ability, the greater the gap between potential and actual performance. And this gap became a source of constant torment instead of motivation. You're doing exactly what killed Foster, comparing actual performance to an idealized version of yourself that only exists in theory and using that impossible comparison as evidence of failure. If you recognize that you make these 5 mental errors and want to learn how Winters corrected them, leave your like now. Don't abandon this major who identified exactly how discipline is systematically destroyed by invisible mental patterns. After identifying the 5 mental errors that destroyed discipline, Winters developed a specific protocol that he executed every day to intercept each error before it could do damage. It wasn't a complex or elaborate protocol. It was a brutal system of self-observation and immediate correction that he practiced for 23 days surrounded in Bastogne. Winters noted that the first part of the protocol was recognizing that he himself constantly committed all 5 errors. He wasn't immune. His mind negotiated, waited for motivation, confused intention with execution, transformed failures into collapse, and compared himself to impossible potential. But the difference was that he had trained his attention to identify each error the moment it arose. When he caught himself internally negotiating whether he should execute an order, he immediately interrupted the negotiation and executed without completing the mental debate. When he noticed that he was waiting to feel motivated before acting, he forced immediate action even without motivation and watched motivation appear afterward. When he realized he was planning instead of executing, he stopped all planning and executed any small action immediately. He wrote, "I discovered that the 5 errors don't disappear. They keep popping up every day, but I can intercept them in the initial seconds before they gain momentum." During those days, Winters practiced constant mental vigilance, not to suppress thoughts, but to recognize when a thought was one of the 5 errors disguised as normal thinking, and the moment he recognized it, he applied specific correction. For the negotiation error, immediate execution without completing the debate. For the error of waiting for motivation, forced action followed by observation of motivation arising. For the error of confusing intention with execution, brutal counting of actual actions versus mental plans. For the error of turning failure into collapse, verbal recognition that a small failure is exactly that, a small failure that does not invalidate overall discipline. For the error of comparing with potential, absolute focus on current execution under current conditions without reference to theoretical ability. Winters described how this protocol required significant mental energy in the first few days, but after 2 weeks of constant practice, recognition of the 5 errors became automatic. He no longer needed conscious effort to identify them. His mind had been trained to signal an alert the moment any of the 5 patterns began to emerge. But what I highlighted was the part where Winters explained that protocol didn't eliminate the 5 errors. It only prevented them from destroying discipline. His mind kept trying to negotiate, wait for motivation, confuse intention with execution, transform failures into collapse and compare them with potential. But he didn't allow these mental patterns to control actions. He recognized, corrected, and executed. You are not practicing the mental vigilance that Winters developed. You allow the 5 errors to operate freely without interruption, without correction, systematically destroying discipline while you don't even realize it's happening. When the German attack finally came on December 16th, Winters had been running the correction protocol for 2 weeks, and he documented in brutal detail the difference between soldiers who recognized the 5 errors versus soldiers who let them operate freely. Soldiers who didn't recognize the errors suffered a progressive mental breakdown. They negotiated orders instead of executing them, waited to feel brave before acting, planned the perfect response instead of responding, used every failure as justification to give up completely, and compared execution under fire with the ability they had in training. And this combination of the 5 errors transformed technically competent soldiers into paralyzed men. Winters noted, "I watched men die, not because German bullets were impossible to avoid, but because the 5 mental errors paralyzed them as bullets came. They negotiated whether they should move, waited to feel ready before acting, planned the perfect movement instead of moving, treated the first failure as a total collapse, and compared every action to an idealized version that didn't exist under real fire. But Winters also documented soldiers who survived because they applied immediate corrections. When they caught themselves internally bargaining, they interrupted and executed. When they noticed they were waiting for motivation, they forced action and watched courage appear during execution. When they realized they were over-planning, they executed the imperfect movement immediately. When they failed, they recognized it as an isolated failure and continued executing. When they began to compare it to theoretical ability, they brutally focused on what was possible to execute now. And this constant mental vigilance maintained functional discipline even when everything around them was absolute chaos. Winters described a specific moment on the 9th day when he himself began to bargain whether he should execute an order that seemed suicidal. His mind offered logical reasons why that order didn't make sense, why it should be questioned, why waiting would be wiser. And he immediately recognized mental error 1, internal bargaining. He interrupted the debate, executed the order without completing the thought, and discovered that the order that seemed suicidal mentally was perfectly executable physically. But what I highlighted was the passage where Winters explained that the 5 errors didn't disappear under pressure. They intensified. A mind under stress produced more negotiation, more waiting for motivation, more confusion between intention and execution, more transformation of failures into collapse, more comparison with impossible potential. And soldiers who hadn't trained in recognition and correction were completely overwhelmed. But soldiers who had practiced protocol for weeks recognized errors even when intensified and corrected them automatically. You will face pressure where the 5 errors will intensify exponentially, and if you haven't practiced recognizing and correcting them now, you will be completely overwhelmed when real pressure arrives. Major Joseph Winters survived 23 days surrounded in Bastogne and lived another 50 years after the war. When he died in 1994, he left a final diary entry, written just days before his death. Winters had noted, "I lived 73 years, but the 23 days in Bastogne taught me more about discipline than all the other years combined. I didn't learn that discipline is willpower or determination. I learned that discipline is silently murdered by 5 mental errors that seem like normal thoughts. And the 18 soldiers who died under my command didn't die because they were weak. They died because no one taught them that the human mind produces patterns that destroy discipline from the inside out. I spent 50 years practicing recognizing and correcting the 5 errors every day. And that practice saved me more times in civilian life than it did in combat. I had kept this last entry separately because it proved that the 5 mental errors were not a wartime phenomenon. They were permanent patterns of the human mind that destroy discipline in any context if they are not recognized and corrected. During those 50 years after Bastogne, Winters maintained constant mental vigilance. Internal bargaining arose daily and he immediately interrupted it. Waiting for motivation constantly appeared, and he forced action without it. Confusion between intention and execution tried to deceive him, and he brutally recounted actual actions. Transformation of failures into collapse threatened daily, and he recognized failures as isolated incidents. Comparison with impossible potential persisted, and he focused on current execution. And Winters wrote, "In 1989, the 5 errors never disappeared. My mind still tries to destroy discipline through the same patterns I observed killing soldiers in 1944, but 50 years of practice have given me the automatic ability to recognize and correct them before they do real harm." You are reading about Winters 80 years after he identified the 5 mental errors that silently destroy discipline. 80 years, and the truth hasn't changed. Your discipline isn't being destroyed by laziness or weakness. It's being murdered by 5 mental patterns you don't even recognize as destructive. If you want to honor Major Joseph Winters and the 18 soldiers who died because no one taught them to recognize the 5 errors, then like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment describing which of the 5 mental errors most destroys your discipline. Don't abandon this major who meticulously documented how discipline dies. Help spread this knowledge to other soldiers who are being destroyed by invisible mental patterns without understanding what's happening. Which of these 5 mental errors most destroys your discipline without you realizing it? And how much longer will you allow invisible patterns to systematically murder the discipline you struggle to build?